There were about 75,600 total deaths in Australia during the first 5 months of the year, which was about 10,800 more than usual. That is an extra 415 deaths per week. Now, to be fair, some of those deaths were simply postponed by the lockdown in 2020. These were people suffering terminal conditions that were sadly never going to be cured. But that decrease in 2020 was only 4%, whereas the increase so far this year has been 16.6%. When the Telegraph in London reported 2 weeks ago that there had been an extra 1,000 people dying per week because of the delayed effect of the lockdown, it was front page news. But when a similar rate per head of population is reported in Australia, silence. You can understand a certain reluctance to admit that the lockdowns and vaccines caused more harm than good, given that the media pushed them so fervently. The ABC said last month that of all the people who died during the pandemic, only 2.3% died with COVID. And of those, only 82% actually died of COVID, not with it. The government needed to inflate the figures to make them seem scary, but even then, they didn't justify the lockdown. While some media outlets are quietly reversing their stance on the lockdowns and vaccines, others are doubling down. The ABC reports today, for example, that there have been 11 COVID deaths in Australia today. It doesn't say whether those deaths were with or from the virus. A year ago, 11 deaths in a day would have been enough to identify the source of the outbreak, isolate it, send in police and troops, and then allow masked TV journalists to roam the streets to make sure nobody had snuck out for a healthy walk in the park. The reason we don't do that anymore is that the public have finally realised, even if some journalists haven't, that the pandemic was used by governments to increase their power, by Big Pharma to increase their profits, and by the media to hang on to their dwindling readerships. One columnist in the West Australian today referred to Premier Mark McGowan embarrassingly as, quote, state daddy. This is the Premier who locked the state down but failed to stop the virus from entering the state. The columnist said, quote, after the proposed Royal Commission, we will have a much better estimate of how much exponential death and disability was prevented over the last 2 years by our state dads' prompt actions. Well, after today's mortality statistics, we already have proof that the lockdowns and vaccines caused an increase in deaths. Lord Jonathan Sumption, a historian and former British Supreme Court judge, said in the Times of London recently, quote, throughout history, fear has been the chief instrument of authoritarian rule. During the lockdown, it was what enabled the government to silence dissent and inhibit discussion, unquote. That the media ever went along with this is astonishing. They might like to get on board the backlash before the spotlight turns on them too.